Every time I find an old document or whatever, I feel like they tell a story. And some of them, it's a very common story. It's not something that you're ever going to read about in a history book, but they were people and they had everyday lives and they had to function, and there was no email, there was no internet or anything like that. So everything had to be printed.
Hello and welcome to the Dragon Tree Podcast, a show where we talk to great communicators about how they do what they do. I'm your host, Chris Hobson, and today we're speaking with Bob Sullivan, the owner of Sullivan Press. Bob is a historical interpreter who, since 1989, has been recreating old books and other documents from different eras of American history. Bob, it's great speaking with you today.
Well, thanks, Chris. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. Today we'll be talking about how and why in an increasingly digital landscape you find it important to stay rooted in the physical historical world with your preservation work. And just to let you know, I was a history major in college, so I find this stuff particularly interesting, and I'm a bit of a nerd, so hopefully we'll keep it relevant for everyone today. Well, just also to add that little context as to how we met, I met you at a holiday event that was hosted at Mount Vernon late last year, which is George Washington's home in near Alexandria, Virginia. And you had set up like a tent where you were demonstrating your bookbinding techniques, and you had other kinds of documents that we'll go over and talk about today on display there. And I was struck by how realistic, particularly your books were, and how realistic they look compared to museum pieces I've seen in the past. So kind of with that intro, I was wondering, about the origins of this. This is such an interesting approach you take. So you create and sell books, as we mentioned, but also stationery, playing cards, and even old currency. So I'm wondering, first off, where this idea of preserving old print forms came from.
Well, I used to reenact, and when I was doing reenacting, we were always interested in accurate reproductions. We wanted to try to be as accurate as possible, and of course, that's come a long way. I go back 50 years doing this stuff, and accuracy has come a long way. But it was along with that. It's what did the common soldiers have, and what did they have, and so it was a long time ago, I attended a small Civil War reenactment, and the invitation was a draft notice, and they gave us enlistments and discharges, and these things were beautiful reproductions. And I thought, gee, this looks nice in the Civil War era. I wonder who's doing this. And I also thought, nobody's doing this in the Revolutionary War, and I should start doing this, and I could make a killing at this. Well, no, that didn't happen. But I used to write computer manuals, and I was familiar with desktop publishing. So I saw some old Revolutionary War forms in a book, and I thought, I could probably reproduce those. And I tried, and then I thought I could probably sell them. And so 35 years ago, I tried, and it's kind of evolved from there.
You sort of just jumped in with both feet. It sounds like there's no probably two ways about it. Yeah. Well, and in an interesting way, I think the way I think of it as coming out at it from completely outsiders, like what you're doing is kind of upholding a tradition of how people communicated. This podcast is a lot about talking to communicators. So it's really upholding a tradition of how people used to communicate long ago. And I was wondering if you could say something about why you find that important in this kind of era, again, this kind of fast-paced digital era of communication.
Well, everything that I look at, every time I find an old document or whatever, I feel like they tell a story. And some of them, it's a very common story. It's not something that you're ever going to read about in a history book, but they were people and they had everyday lives and they had to function, and there was no email, there was no internet or anything like that. So everything had to be printed. News was printed on paper and put up at the local tavern or the local gathering place. And that's how people got their news. Along with some weekly newspapers and things like that. So any kind of important event, anything that was important in their lives back then was printed. And so we just need to understand that. I think that we need to understand how it was done then. I tend to divide things, and I hope I'm not rambling here, but I tend to divide things into the eras into BI and AI, which is before internet and after internet.
Oh,
And a
okay.
lot of people don't even realize that a lot of history existed before the internet, especially
Right.
younger people. And not necessarily just younger people. I remember having a conversation last summer with some people, with a group of people, and somebody said, "I don't think our country has ever been so divided. I've never known in our history our country's
That's my
ever been so
favorite. Yeah.
divided." And I said, there was a civil war
Right.
160 years ago. So it's like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. It's just so sometimes people just need to be reminded every once in a while of how people communicated back then and what history was back then.
Yeah, that's what I often think is whenever I'm reading nonfiction or especially history, it really helps put me at ease to realize people have gone through far worse things. So it's good that it's good that I'm not the only one out there feeling that way. Well, like as you alluded to earlier, your work mostly covers like colonial, Revolutionary War, American Civil War, and World War II eras. And with such a wide swath of history, I'm wondering why those particular eras. Why you focus on those time periods in particular.
I started out as a Revolutionary War reenactor, and Sullivan Press started out as strictly Revolutionary War things. And then I was also a Civil War reenactor, and I realized that there's 10 times as many Civil War reenactors as Revolutionary War reenactors.
Oh,
Plus,
okay.
It's much easier to find Civil War military originals than it is to find Revolutionary War original documents. So, and I can actually afford a lot of Civil War original documents, and so I evolved into that. Now, as far as the World War II goes, that's a much smaller section of my product line. But a friend of mine, who's been my friend since fifth grade, is a serious World War II collector. And he asked me to reproduce some of the stuff that he had because he wanted some labels for some of his things, and he wanted, some paperwork for some of his things. So I kind of got involved in that. I always kid him because he had to build an extra building in his yard to hold his collection. Wow. And I said, that's why I collect paper, because I just have a couple of binders of stuff on my shelf.
So he created an actual museum.
Oh, he actually does have a museum down in Baltimore. He does. He's a part-time, he's a semi-retired private school teacher, and on the grounds of his private school, they've actually created a museum where he housed some of his collection, not much.
Wow! So it's like a smaller version of Thomas Jefferson with the Library of Congress.
Yeah. Oh yeah,
that's really cool. That's really good. Yeah, and that ensures it'll endure and other generations will see it. That's wonderful. Well, I was also, one of the real selling features of your tent when we were at Mount Vernon was the fact that you actually had a setup. You had the machine, the very I hesitate to call it a machine because it was kind of so old, but I guess technically it was a machine where you were kind of binding books. And I was wondering if you could just give us like a lens into how you maybe if you want to just stay with books, how you actually create that. And I'm happy to talk about other processes with other documents, but the book part of it was so interesting to me. Can you just kind of give us an overview of how that actually works?
Sure. When you are creating a book, you take the pages, and if the book is printed, the pages, all of the pages in a colonial book will have either just a letter or a letter and a number in the bottom right corner of the page. And that's how you know which pages are to be folded together to make what they call the signature. So and I just have something here. So when, this is coming apart from the other day, but that's all right. So to sew these together, and I'll just put this up in the camera here, but to sew this together, this is sewn together you sew the paper to the cords that you see there, and on the ends you sew the paper to itself. So it's sewn to the cord and it's sewn to the paper. And when that's done, you trim it, and you attach a cover. You take most of the cord off, you cut most of the cord off, but you leave just a little bit, and you glue the cardboard to that. And when that's finished, you put the leather on it, and then you finally put the marble paper on it, and it ends up looking something like this. And there's your signatures. You can see the signatures in the thing, and the bumps that you see are the cords that hold the book together. So that's how you make books in the colonial time. So.
Interesting. Yeah, I always wondered what those bumps were on the spine. So you kind of demystified a lot of that. One thing you explained, like some of our modern words actually come from that era. I think stereotype was one of them.
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, like I don't know if you could, just for our audience, because I like that story. Could you quickly say where that came from?
Well, I always wondered how, if a book was a success, how it was reprinted, because you are setting every letter by hand and
Right.
and spacing them correctly and everything else, and you're setting them in the second quarter of the 19th century, like around 1840, 45, 50, somewhere around there. They came up with a technique called stereo printing, and it has nothing to do with sound. But what they
Right.
did was, after they laid out all the type on the press, they poured plaster of Paris on it and made a mold, and poured lead in that mold and made a plate out of that mold. And that was literally the PDF of the 19th century. If the book was a
Right.
hit, they would they just used the plates.
Hmm.
So anyway, because it was called stereo printing, those plates were called stereotypes, and that's where the word comes from, something repeated
Hmm.
constantly and constantly. And the French word for those plates was cliché, which is where
Cliche.
that word
Right.
comes from.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's so interesting. We're learning all kinds of etymology and history today. That's great. Well, it's very evident from what you were just saying that you pride yourself on being very authentic, and like I said, everything is done by hand. At least the parts you showed to us. So, why is it important to stick to these original manufacturing processes? And I'll also add that on your website, you're very careful about saying everything you see is basically reproduced. I try to research everything to the T and do it exactly as they would have. So why is that so important to you to adhere to that standard?
I have a lot of judges in the reenacting world. People come
Oh,
by, and they want to know that something is accurate. And often um, people will say, "Well, I've seen an original; it doesn't look like that. Mine, you know." And I said, "Yeah, I know, but I'm reproducing this one. This is the original one,
oh, okay.
and I'm not reproducing all of them. I don't claim it to be generic, and I really don't." Follow all of them, because I don't print the stuff on a press. I do use a laser printer, but and but I make them one at a time, because basically I don't know anybody else that does it that I can afford. So
Ah,
I'm kind of cheap, so I do it myself. I've learned how to do these things, and I end up with a product that pretty much looks the same as the original. And again, I try to compare, because people will ask me, what's your source for this? That's very common, that people will say, what's your source for this? And I go, well, here's my source.
mm, that's great to hear. There's like a self-regulating community, it sounds like.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
No, and it's interesting that I actually didn't know that you combine like modern technology as far as like a laser printer with the, I guess it stands to reason. I mean, where are you going to house a huge, printing press in your house? But that, yeah. So is that one of the sort of concessions you make to modernity, is you have a laser printer? Is there any other kind of concessions you have to make just because of practicality?
Not a lot, no, because I do
Okay.
use the modern glues, which are archival glue. It's the same glue that
Oh,
bookbinding restor well restoration archivists. It's the stuff that they use, and I did learn bookbinding from a former Williamsburg bookbinder, who's a
okay.
great guy. But the only concession I do make is that I do print them on a laser printer. Although when I create a book, I'll find a book in the public domain. Most of the stuff I work with is in the public domain, and I can
Okay.
find a PDF, because over 150 years it's in the public domain. So I'll find it,
Right.
the
Right.
PDF, and of course the pages have to be rearranged in signature order. And when I say that, what I mean is page 1 has to be next to page 16, and page 2 has to be next to page 15, so that when you fold them all, and it goes that way, so when you fold them, they come out in order.
Okay.
So I'll take the PDF and I'll put it into Adobe InDesign, and I'll arrange the pages so that they're in the right order. They're next to each other. The signatures are correct, and then I produce a PDF from it, which is kind of like stereo printing, because once I have the PDF, then I can make what I need.
Right. Right.
So it's a
Yeah. And
combination.
It's a combination, right? Yeah. I mean, there's no one. I mean, you almost have to be like in a museum for it to be kind of 100% like that. But yeah, and this is probably not a fair question, but just putting you on the spot. You talked about bestsellers, and I'm sure that the criteria for a bestseller was different in the colonial era, different in Civil War era, different in World War II. But was there a common thread of like how would they even know something was a bestseller? I mean, obviously, if something sells out day one, that's a bestseller. But what was there? Are you familiar with the criteria they judge that by in those different eras, where they would resort to the stereotyping?
The one publisher whose books that I collect, which is Beadle and Adams, they are the ones that invented the dime novel. They invented it in 1860. That was the very first dime novel they ever produced. They did produce dime books before that, but they did sort of how-to books. For example, this is an 1860 cookbook that they produced, Beadle's Dime Cookbook.
All right.
And this is a example of the Beadle's Dime Family Physician. So they produced these books sort of like the original, one of the original Dummy series is really what they were.
Right.
But they were, in what I've read, they marketed some of their novels, and they literally produced on some of these things tens of thousands of copies over the lifespan of the novel. So some of them were big hits, some of them were not. But because they stereo printed almost everything, if a book was a hit, they had the plates and they were ready to reproduce it.
Yeah, maybe back then it was self-evident what a bestseller was if something just was sold out, after a certain day or two or something like that. That's interesting. Yeah. So I think you've kind of alluded to it in your earlier answers, and you talk about having learned this from I think you said a Williamsburg person, historical expert. So is this, would you say this process is in jeopardy of being forgotten in any way, or is that part of your drive is to help keep this alive for future generations? Is that part of what's
I think so. And I always look around to see if there's any younger people coming into this thing, because most of the people that reproduce this stuff are getting up in years, including me. And there are a couple. I've met a couple of people who are trying to carry this on. Now, as far as reproducing documents and books and things, there's about 3 or 4 of us that I know of that do this on a sort of a semi-full-time or full-time basis. As far as other crafts, there's a lot of people out there that reproduce pottery, they reproduce soaps and things like that. They reproduce glass items. All kinds of things, iron work, that kind of stuff. And they use the old techniques. There's a market fair coming up in April where there will be about 90 or so different vendors selling things. And the Mount Vernon, you mentioned that earlier, they have a market fair in the fall, and there's about 40 of us that go there. So there are some people, and I just was at another fair where they make flintlock rifles. Literally from scratch. It's amazing what they do. But again, there's not a lot of younger people doing that kind of thing. So, but there's, I'd say, I was talking to my wife about this this morning when we were, and I said, there's probably 100, 150 or so, or whatever people that do this. She goes, well, if you think about it, that's not that many people.
Right.
So, but yeah, there are people that do these crafts.
Yeah, and I guess with the advent of 3D printing, a lot of people are like, well, I'll just print it, or something like that. Yeah. But they don't have those high standards probably. Well, and that's like a perfect segue to my next question, which is like, in addition to reproducing books and documents, you also collect historical items, which is also on your website. And we'll put a link to the website in our show notes today.
Thanks.
So no problem. So for instance, you have like a flatware set from the Civil War. I saw like pencils, pencil sharpeners, like erasers, things you wouldn't think maybe they had way back when. So I'm wondering if your passion for collecting these kind of items stems from that same wellspring of wanting to preserve documents, or is that a whole separate kind of calling for you?
Well, I have a few items that are not paper, but most of my collection really is paper items. And I just put that out there just for information purposes. Like, here, you want to buy a flatware set? This is what they look like.
Right. Right, right. And actually, it was interesting because at those tents at Mount Vernon, like we keep talking about, and I encourage people to go to these festivals. I think you said there's one in the fall, and probably at some point in the spring, summer, they'll probably have something. They always have something going on there. But if you're local to the DC area or the wider, DC, Baltimore area, they have these things where they've unearthed stuff from Mount Vernon that's been like I think there were like jars of cherries that recently made the news.
Yeah.
Where they buried this stuff. So it's just things that were actually used day to day by George Washington's staff and things, which is really interesting. So anyway, it's I feel like it's always changing, even though it's old and in the past. It's always changing and always new things are happening. So it's cool that I think that comes through in your work for sure.
They're always finding new things. Yeah.
They're always finding new things. So which of you, I guess, just to ask you a personal question, which of your reproductions are you most proud of and why?
Well, that's kind of like asking which one of your kids you like the best.
Right.
It's really hard to say some of those things. But I think one of the things that I've always been proud of is the fact that years ago, and I mean years ago, I saw an original letter of marque in the National Archives on a display. Now, a letter of marque is what prevented somebody from being hanged as a pirate. It was a legal way to capture shipping during wartime. And actually, they still exist. But if you had a fast ship, you could capture a merchant ship. You could take it into a neutral port, and they would auction the whole thing. They'd sell it off, and the owner of the ship got money, the captain got money, they split the rest of it up among the crew. And if you had a good ship and you weren't captured, then you could make a lot of money. So, but there was a risk. And the only thing that kept you from being hung as a pirate, because technically you're capturing a ship on the open ocean, was this letter of marque issued by the government. Well, okay, so that's a long story, but let me just say this. On the letter of marque, it says that it says fill in the name, and I don't know that I can make this actually show up, but it says having given bond, which is right there, and then it also says that they received a copy of the instructions, it says the instructions herewith. Well, I was in the New Hampshire Historical Society, and I found an original set of privateer's instructions.
Oh my gosh.
And then I was going through a book that a friend of mine owned, and they had this, which is actually, this is a reproduction of a bond, a privateer's bond.
Okay. So
I have all three documents, and I found them in 3 different states and 3 different things, and I put this thing together, and I was pretty proud of that, because I actually have something here that is kind of unique, and I found it.
That's a lot of legwork. I know. Did you set out to do that, or you just happened to see it at a museum and said, "Wow, if I can get this and this would be a really cool collection"? Is that kind of how it happened?
Yeah, just found the one and thought, and then I happened to stumble upon the second one and thought, well, maybe I should start looking for the third one now. And
yeah, really.
And they appear. You never know where they're going to show up, but they just show up.
Yeah, totally. And that's actually on your website. You talk about some of the ongoing fun of the business is discovering and reproducing new forms all the time. So even with we keep bringing it back to the internet, but it sounds like even despite that, there's still a whole lot to discover. So is there anything out there that you haven't done that you would like to do? Any kind of reproductions?
Well, it's been I've been doing this for 35 years, and it's been a 35-year quest, I think, to find officers' commissions from all 13 colonies.
Oh, okay.
I have found 11. I still have not found a South Carolina officer's commission or a Delaware officer's commission.
Okay.
Now, the rarest one of all of them was a Georgia officer's commission, because Georgia had very few troops in the Continental Army. And yet a friend of mine he goes, well, I got one of those. And so he had an original Georgia commission. So I found that one. But I found the other 11, but I'm still looking for those 2. And I've had people searching for me in the archives and the historical societies and things, and still haven't found one yet.
Yeah, you talk about in the kind of about us section of your website, you talk about how so many forms were destroyed when when the British burned Washington in 1814 during the War of 1812. And I just wonder, are you like, what's the percentage chance that those are just gone? I mean, is I know those are far from Washington. It didn't have anything to do with the burning of Washington, but just to play that out, is it possible that those sorts of things are just gone because of all the conflicts and everything?
I have to believe that they're around somewhere. Okay. I just, somebody's going to find it in an attic, or somebody's going to find it in some other thing. But it's very rare that when I used to do some searches, I would go to state archives and things, and I would ask to look at someone famous from that state. I would ask to look for their papers, because nobody catalogs printed forms in the library collection. So you could find papers that way. But yeah, it's, maybe they'll show up someday, maybe.
Yeah, and the fact that back then, so it wasn't very standardized. Like it wasn't like it was an actual country. It was like 13 countries coming together, and so like it wasn't like officers' commissions were just centralized and coming from one place. They probably all look different, I would imagine. Is that correct? They're all different looking.
They look different. Most of them have standard text in them. They have the standard wording and stuff. The only one that's a little different is Rhode Island. And that one is, they're like, you will hunt them down and kill them. I mean, they're pretty serious. They take it very seriously in Rhode Island.
Nobody knew about Rhode Islanders. Yeah,
I know, but most of them, most of the commissions are pretty standard as far as the wording goes.
Yeah, and probably have some sort of, you have to. Was it just was there an end point usually for a commission? Right. I mean, it wasn't like we're just putting you in the army and there's no end date, right?
At the pleasure of the Congress, that's usually what they say. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Oh, interesting. That's so interesting. Well, for our audience, if you're out there and you have a South Carolina or a Delaware commission, please let us know. Get in touch with me or Bob, and we will be very grateful to you. Well, thank you so much, Bob, for joining us today. This was very enlightening. And if anyone wants to continue this important conversation, where can they contact you?
They can contact me through the website at Sullivan Press. I have an email address, owner, like I own it, at owner@sullivanpress.com. I'd be happy to answer that. Yeah, that's probably the best way to get a hold of me.
Excellent. And we'll put all that information in our show notes. Well, thanks so much, Bob. We really appreciate you coming by today.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris. Thanks very much.